Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, weekly radio news magazine we put together for you here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Thank you for making us part of your weekend tooling around. Maybe some of you are getting us via podcast. You get at the website tertiumquids.org. Great program today, and we kick it off with the football that may result in a Virginia government shutdown. The brinksmanship over Medicaid expansion, which mysteriously, like something in one of these zombie TV shows, returned from what many people thought was the dead this year in the Virginia budget. Joining us is the founder of the Obamacare Truth Squad, Christopher Wright. Chris, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
We're good. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. And thank you for everything you've been doing. You've been at it for some time now, trying to keep an eye on the fraud that is this idea of the government's here to take care of your health care. And were you, I'm just curious how many of the folks who had been covering this since 08, 09 as it started to grow, were you as surprised as I was when out of left field the Virginia GOP were the authors of a new Medicaid expansion plan in the light of a new president and the death knells of Obamacare?
Well, I guess it's like, what's her name? I've forgotten her name. She's a comedian, and she said, no matter how cynical I get, it's never enough. Lily Tomlin. Lily Tomlin.
Yes, it does. I remember that line. You did a brilliant piece where you went and asked them for some truth on some of these parts of Medicaid expansion that, embarrassingly, we haven't even poked around on. We've started in on the idea that the premise that the federal government is sending us our money back, which has been the Democrats' defense all along, isn't going to happen. Mick Mulvaney said just as much to the Virginia House. But you started asking them even tougher questions about the fraud that is this idea that Medicaid is this panacea. So what has been the response? What have been some of the questions, and what have been the responses you've been getting?
I kicked off the series. This is an ongoing series, not just one piece, and I'm directing these questions this year to Delegate Chris Jones, who apparently is the mastermind behind the GOP shift in the House towards Medicaid expansion. I directed many of the same questions to Governor McAuliffe in 2016, didn't get any responses. And I'm not getting any answers out of Chris Jones either, but I kicked this series off with a very basic philosophical question, and that is, why is it a good idea to change Medicaid from a poverty program into a middle-class entitlement? Now, the progressives will tell you this is a great triumph. Look at how many people we got on this government program, and I'm looking at it and I'm saying this is a great tragedy. Look at how many more people have become dependent on government. Yeah. So it's definitely a philosophical choice here, and you can clearly see which side of the ledger I'm on. I went from there to the experience in other states. Now, former Governor McAuliffe urged us all in one of his last budget messages to consider the experience of other states with Medicaid expansion. Well, this is no longer a blank slate. This is not tabula rasa. This is not something new. Some states have been at this for years now, and their experience is horrible. Every single Medicaid expansion state has exceeded their enrollment projections by an average of 110%. That's more than double. And so the question I put to Delegate Jones was, how do you know the same thing won't happen in Virginia? I went from there to ask what I think is a very simple common sense question. Who has studied the question of what will happen to the Virginia budget if Medicaid expansion enrollment is double what they expect here in the state? Where are the studies, the actual studies that show what happens to state expenditures in Virginia if enrollment doubles? If no such studies exist, how can legislators in good conscience pretend that they're anywhere near being responsible if they don't know the answers to those questions? If they don't know what will happen to the state budget if their numbers are way off? What programs will they cut? What taxes will they raise if Medicaid expansion explodes here in Virginia like it has everywhere else? And I didn't get any response to that question either.
That's the real, I mean, that's almost a cornerstone question, Chris, is that And we've seen this in Oregon and many other states, this doubling and near doubling and way overwhelming. I guess it was the mid-'90s. Medicaid was, well, look, it's so much more efficient than most health insurance companies because it was so small of a population. And as the population grew, it became just like every other government program, bureaucracy heavy and benefit poor.
Well, one of the things that people don't understand about Medicaid is that it's an open-ended entitlement. There's no cap on it. So however many people show up, that's how much money you're going to spend. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that it's not sustainable. Medicaid by itself accounts for something like 10% of the federal deficit every year. Now, people will come to me and they'll say, well, you just don't want poor people to have health care. And my response is, my view is the only view that's compassionate in the long run, because my view is the only view that's sustainable in the long run. So we've got these progressives running around making all these promises, and they're not going to be able to keep them in the long run, and I think that's cruel.
Well, and you bring up the best point, and we've tried to make this case as well, that in an economic collapse, then you see, and I don't know if it's just an arrogance that we don't think our economy could go the same way.
Well, the Truth Squad, the Obamacare Truth Squad, has said from the beginning that Obamacare was going to be a disaster, and Medicaid expansion is part of Obamacare. Not a lot of people remember that. The other thing is that we have also said from the beginning that government intervention in health care it further moves in that direction. That's the wrong way to go, and you can clearly see that if you play it out to its logical conclusion. Single-payer systems around the world, like Venezuela, they all have enormous problems. We don't need those problems here.
We're visiting with Chris Wright, who is the founder of the Obamacare Truth Squad. He's been chasing Delegate Chris Jones and other members of the GOP caucus to try to get answers on Medicaid expansion that the House has mysteriously decided now would be a good time to do. You talked about the doubling of the enrollments, but we found out from Mick Mulvaney very quickly that the 90% of the funding that they're counting on is going away as well, as it was predicted the first time this idea was floated around the chambers of the General Assembly. That, well, it's 95%. What if it becomes 90? Oh, then it became 90. Well, it'll stay 90. Well, what if it becomes 80 and 60 and 50? And now it's looking like it could be zero, Chris.
Well, we have a White House, also leaders in the House, and also noises coming out of the Senate that Medicaid expansion will go away, the funding for it.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't read that monstrous budget bill that was just passed, but I'm assuming that the funding is still there for the moment. But remember, that deal is only for 6 months. So we have pressure coming from the White House and certain quarters in both houses of Congress that want to do away with Medicaid expansion entirely. So here's a question that's also never been answered, and it's been asked from the very beginning, and that is, what happens to states that expand Medicaid? Washington pulls the rug out from under them, cuts funding to zero, and then says, and oh, by the way, this is a Roach Motel, this is Hotel California, you can't get out of it. You are legally obligated to continue your Medicaid expansion program. And there were warnings from think tanks in the beginning of all this back 6-7 years ago that was the legal status of legal play there. So this is a question that's also never been answered. What happens if Washington just pulls the rug out from under this entirely? Can Virginia get out of it? That's not clear.
Now, you also brought up a great point in your series of questions for Chris Jones regarding the fact that it's a movable feast, that, you know, what is Medicaid expansion today becomes a whole new family of Medicaid expansions.
Bad news about Medicaid expansion keeps rolling in every day. Just from last week, this is just 1 week of bad news from last week, and that is, let's see, there was New Hampshire. They are trying to cut their Medicaid expansion program back from 138% of the federal poverty line back to 100%. And the same thing is happening in Arkansas. They're trying to cut back their expansion. And the Arkansas case is interesting because they have applied to the federal government to roll it back, and the federal government has said, well, we're not going to answer you right now. So this request has been pending for 9 months. Arkansas can't get an answer out of the feds, and so they're stuck with their bank-breaking Medicaid expansion program in Arkansas. And then also just in the news last week was the fact that Medicaid expansion is blowing up in Michigan, and the Chamber of Commerce is very concerned about it there. So that's just 1 week's bad news. I've been collecting the bad news on Medicaid expansion for years. There's tons of this stuff.
Well, and part of it is, one of the more popular parts is that doctors don't want to be participants in Medicaid. So what winds up happening? What's the game plan if we see a mass exodus of doctors? Do we conscript doctors? Do we force doctors? Do we make that a requirement of your medical license that in order to be a doctor you have to take this many percentage of patients as Medicaid? And then what kind of care are they going to get?
Well, actually, that has been proposed to solve the doctor shortage. There's already been proposals coming from the progressive left that as a condition of getting a medical license, they want to federalize medical licenses and say, if you do that, we're going to send you to Montana or Wyoming and some place where you don't want to practice, and you have to stay there for 5 years, and then we'll let you get on to the rest of it. So the left, they don't understand, or maybe they do understand, and they're perfectly fine with it, but there's a lot of force involved in all these things. So hey, more power to them. Free your inner fascist. If you want to force doctors to take Medicaid patients, hey, have at it. Let's just make America into one big concentration camp. How about that?
Well, and you see, and there are doctors that seem to think it's an okay idea. I don't know what makes them think it that way. Maybe they just don't think it's going to befall them. And maybe you're right. If they let their inner fascist out, the doctors that had been supporters of Obamacare and Medicaid expansions would then turn around and say, whoa, that's not what we looked for. But then we go back to your earlier point is we're locked in and now we can't get out.
That could very well happen.
So the left wants to run behind as you pointed out earlier, Chris Wright is the founder of the Obamacare Truth Squad on with us this week. You pointed out earlier very correctly, the left loves to run into it, but they're poorer, and you're telling them they can't go to a doctor. They're not going to doctors. We've seen this out of Oregon, and you write about it as well. They're going to ERs, which supposedly is what this Obamacare experiment was supposed to stop, and they're getting worse health care. Talk about that, Chris.
Sure, a couple of aspects there. Everything they told us was wrong. One of the things they said was that if you have Medicaid expansion, then that will cut down on the use of emergency rooms, and people will stop going to emergency rooms. They'll have a doctor assigned to them under Medicaid, and everything will be fine. Well, story after story after story after story shows that in expansion states, emergency room use goes up, not down. And then they said, oh, well, this is happening. We didn't expect it, but that's just pent-up demand. That will go away after a while. And the later stories I'm seeing saying, no, it's not going away. It's persisting. So what they told us that emergency room use would go down. Instead of going down, it's going up. Now, in terms of health outcomes, Medicaid, there is empirical data. There are studies that show that Medicaid produces inferior health outcomes to health insurance, private health insurance, no surprise there, but also to not having any insurance at all in some aspects. So that's pretty crazy. And so you have all these politicians running around saying we're doing something great when they're condemning people to a program that produces worse health outcomes in some cases than having no insurance at all. And so the standard question that's always asked of these politicians at that point is, would you condemn your own family? Is this what you want for you and your own family? Would you go on this program?
Well, I don't have to because, yeah. And that's always been the fatal conceit in this is the people who are making these decisions don't have to wind up living in the pig pen that they make. Chris, what about the poison pill of the work programs that it seems like Ralph Northam is ready to veto. He wrote a couple of bills that don't include them. The Republicans didn't pass those and aren't looking like they're going to. They're going to try to send the Medicaid expansion to the governor with the work bills like Kentucky, like Bill Bowling likes, and Ralph Northam's going to veto them. So does this, at the end of the game, become a big zero, a big nothing burger, to use the MSNBC phrase, and we wind up without Medicaid expansion, but these squishy, middle-of-the-road Republicans can say, well, we tried and Ralph Northam didn't sign it, or does it actually blow up in everyone's face?
Well, I'm not a big fan of work requirements, and here's the deal. You got these people like the Virginia House GOP running around saying, look at how conservative we are, we want work requirements. Well, I'm sorry, all that is conservative lipstick on a statist pig. That's all that is. Like you say, it provides cover. They can go to their constituents and say, see, we did something conservative. Well, there's another problem with the work requirements. Some people believe that if you put in a work requirement for Medicaid expansion, that will keep enrollment from doubling and tripling and getting out of control. Well, here's what happened in Kentucky. Even with the work requirements, and they also had skin in the game, pay some of the premium. Mm-hmm. They had lockout periods. They had anti-fraud provisions. They got everything they wanted in their waiver out of Washington, and they still project that their enrollment for Medicaid expansion will be over 400,000 in 2020 compared to the 188,000 maximum they projected to begin with. So these work requirements do not keep down enrollment. Also, the way the work requirements have been written, proposed here in Virginia, it's like Swiss cheese. They're full of holes. Mm-hmm. And I just, one of the questions, I put this to Chris Jones today, what basis do you have for believing that a work requirement, as it's appeared here in Virginia, will do much of anything at all? I don't believe it.
At the end of the day, and I know you're not a political consultant or analyst, do you think this helps the Republicans keep their majority in the House and Senate, or does it even matter at this point if this is what they're for?
Well, you're right. I'm not a political kind of guy. I'm looking more at the news and trying to relate that to general principles of political philosophy. But I'll tell you this. The supposedly sophisticated view is your Republicans need to behave like Democrats in order to hang on to the world's going that way, so the Republicans have to go that way if they want to keep getting elected. That's the supposedly sophisticated view. And I'm looking at that, and I'm saying to myself, we have the Democrats for that. What do we need you for? Exactly. I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. I think that if they behave like Democrats, people will just vote for Democrats. Mm-hmm. The Republicans don't have, the mainstream Republicans don't have a value proposition anymore.
Well, I guess if we could say one good thing for Ken Cuccinelli and Terry McAuliffe, they kept Bill Bowling from actually becoming governor, so all he can do is write letters to the editor. Also, Chris, I wanted a quick thought on Medicaid expansion as it comes down in Virginia, and we see the crippling effects of it. What do you think? And I know you've asked Chris Jones, and he's avoided the question. How high could the taxes conceivably go? Is there any statistical data from any of the states you've looked at to say, well, here's a state that did it, and the only way they've survived is that they've raised income taxes this much, that much, corporate taxes, whatever it may be?
Well, I don't think things have progressed to that point yet, because I haven't seen news stories quantifying how much taxes will have to be raised and quantifying how much other programs will be cut just to hang on to Medicaid expansion. But I can tell you that discussion is underway in several expansion states. The budget, that you're supposed to have all these state savings and all this wonderful stuff is supposed to happen. Well, it's evaporated in some states, and now their legislatures are looking at big billion-dollar holes in their budgets because of Medicaid expansion. So those discussions are underway. And I put those questions to Chris Jones, too. What taxes will you raise? What programs will you cut? Education, roads? Tell us specifically, what are you going to do if this blows up in Virginia like it's blown up everywhere else?
His website is Obamacare Truth Squad, and no, it's not gone. It's like the zombies in the Walking Dead TV show. We got to get a baseball bat with some barbed wire on it, I think. Chris, thank you for taking a little time out with us, and maybe Chris Jones is just his email is down. I don't know, but maybe he'll get back to you. Let us know if he ever does, and maybe we can continue to keep the pressure on the remaining delegates that can stop this from happening, because I think you're right. At some point, then the Republican Party becomes a footnote in history as an irrelevancy, because they're not even intellectually honest about who they are. Might as well just vote for the ones who are being honest about it. But we do deeply appreciate your visit this week, and thank you very much for taking some time out.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, Gary Schmitt, resident scholar at the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies and the director of the program on American Citizenship, the American Enterprise Institute. Controversy this week. The Trump census might include that question again. Are you a U.S. citizen? Coming up on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, our weekly radio news magazine. Joining us on our next feature article this morning, and I may have dove into this a little bit with you before the elections. I grew up in New York City, and I'm about 12 years younger than the president, and I have very visceral memories of watching Donald Trump enter the public scene and do many of the things we're still seeing and many of you are experiencing for the first time, and it all seems very retro, as if we've seen these things play out before. And on an international level, our next guest is Gary Schmitt. He's the resident scholar and director of the Program for American Citizenship at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the resident scholar at the Ware Center for Security Studies, as well as director for the Program on American Citizenship. And we're going to talk about the president's foreign affairs record so far. Gary, good morning and welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Now, I could take Kim Jong-un out and insert Ed Koch or Tom Keene, who was the governor of New Jersey, and I've seen all of these tactics before on a more localized level, and always to Donald Trump's benefit. We unprecedented week. Kim Jong-un takes his Thomas the Tank Engine to Beijing to meet with President Xi. We dispatch Russian, as if it's an episode of The Americans. All of a sudden, Russians are being kicked out of almost every country in the world after we do it. Almost simultaneously with the media saying, Donald Trump's wreck. What do you mean everyone else is kicking their Russians out? So let's talk about the president and his foreign affairs, what seemed to many people as recklessness, but as we're starting to see some fruits from it, give us a look from where you sit at the American Enterprise Institute, Gary.
Yeah, I think to start, I think the first year, I think the president's policies were not as radical as maybe people expected from the campaign rhetoric. We're in terms of, for example, there's this significant disconnect between the president's rhetoric about Putin and Russia, but then his policies have been they've been more significantly harder on Russia than the previous administration. So there's there's a good deal of uncertainty about exactly what the president has in mind. I take your point about sort of growing up in the New York area. I mean, some of the actions taken by the president, particularly on the tariffs, seem to be part and parcel of what a New York contractor builder would do when it comes to negotiating with his construction crews, his cement crews, the unions, and the like. So,
and the municipal governments.
We have to see how all that plays out. I mean, the president apparently has gotten a new trade agreement with South Korea, which I think surprises people, but it does show that he had a pretty good idea about how to negotiate that.
Well, and you look at even NAFTA, everyone scoffed that he was going to get NAFTA renegotiated, and they're doing that. But specifically with Russia, and because Russia has been such a part of the narrative regarding collusion and all of his campaign aides and meeting with Russian people at restaurants and things like that, and the espionage that seems to be subtext to a lot of the reporting, then part of their story is, well, look, he's never said anything bad. He doesn't tweet anything bad about Vladimir Putin. He called him and congratulated him on his election. Of course, he's in his pocket. It's in the bag. They're making these, and then this happens with the Russian poisoning in England, and the United States immediately, in a way, certainly not in foreign affairs immediacy, but in a way that I don't think we've seen in many years, comes to the stand with an ally and says, listen, you can't do this to one of our friends, and get out of our country.
Yeah, no, it's quite striking. I mean, the action and coordination with allies. I mean, we're talking about over 100, Russian diplomats / spies who've been kicked out of various countries. So, and we took the lead with 60. So you have to be struck by the degree to which his actions, but then they follow on sort of the call to Putin to congratulate him on his election. So it's certainly the case that it's hard to predict, what the president's going to do. In this case, it was the right thing to do.
Is that a good thing from a foreign affairs? Is a certain amount of unpredictability good when it comes to international relations, Gary?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, one of the things you don't want to signal always what you are willing to do because that can be a deterrent to others. On the other hand, it's also can be a downside because there are plenty of countries around the world that need to understand where you stand, including both allies and adversaries. So it's a matter of judgment. Sometimes it's good to hide your cards, and sometimes it's clear to make sure that you have the winning hand. Is
this maelstrom about the residency, the citizenship question in the census, another security issue as he addresses again the wall, E-Verify, and a lot of things regarding citizenship versus presence in the country, because there are many people who will make the case to us that is a security issue, is knowing who's here and are they supposed to be here, and if they're not supposed to be here and we're allowing them for a temporary period of time, keeping tabs on it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a security issue, and I also think, frankly, it's a political issue as well, because if you don't know the citizenship and you're counting people in a particular, sort of, let's say, area, California or some other place, those people get counted as part of the numbers that make up our congressional districts. And so there's actually an incentive for just be blunt, for Democrats to count non-citizens as part of the count because it ups their numbers in representation. So it's both a security issue. Yeah, you really do want to know who's who in your country. But then the second thing is that there's a political edge to this debate as well.
Gary Schmitt is the resident scholar and co-director of the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Gary, another part of this past bumpy couple of weeks with the president has been the signing of the omnibus, in which he referred to it as a necessity for national security to get the funding he needed for the military. And then immediately people found that there was a certain amount of fungibility in that military funding that became the wall. And I don't know if the members of the House and Senate Democratic caucus realized that was going to happen. Is that again something that goes to the president's ability to negotiate and perhaps, as upset as he may have sounded when he was signing this bill, it wasn't necessarily a bad bill for national security, at least?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. The first thing is these omnibus bills are kind of the result of rule changes in the Senate and the appropriation process that really causes such a backlog that you get these continuing resolutions and then these sort of massive omnibus bills as opposed to separate appropriation bills. And I don't think that's a good way to sort of for the Congress to proceed with providing resources for the government's projects. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And actually, the president has tried to sort of force that debate, but Senate Majority Leader McConnell's not budging on that. Let me step back on the defense budget increases, which are quite welcome, obviously. As I was having a conversation with a senior defense official who pointed out that if you went back to 2011 budget and that's before the Budget Control Act and sequestration took place, if you just sort of took that budget and then increased it every year by the amount of inflation, these really quite significant increase this year and next year, talking about $80 billion and then $85 billion more. If you drew a line from that 2011 just with inflation, the current budget with the $80 billion bump just gets you back to that line. So that shows you just kind of the hole that the military was in. So even though everybody's quite pleased, and they should be, with the increase in defense spending, it really just it gets us back to where we once were and doesn't really address the sort of the long-term needs of the military. So I think it's a complicated picture, and tossing in the idea of paying for the wall out of the military budget, which the president has raised, I think the folks in the Pentagon would go, well, geez, we're just trying to get healthy, and now we're going to spend a big chunk of money on the wall. So from the Pentagon point of view, they would say, can't you find the money elsewhere?
Yeah, I see your point on that. Gary, in the State of the Union address here in our flagship city, it was touching because so much is made about the death of one Charlottesvillian during the summer of last year, and very little is talked about the loss of a UVA student named Otto Warmbier, and his parents were at the State of the Union address as a guest of the president, and certainly highlighting not just in an abstract the dangers of dictatorial communism and the dangers of North Korea, but I've heard from members of the U.S. House as well that North Korea is the most dangerous spot right now, that Iran is second, maybe closer than some think, maybe not. But do you share that view that North Korea, that maybe this train ride to visit with President Xi acting as somewhat of a go-between to, set up these meetings that the president says he'll have with Kim Jong-un are all good to diffuse what had been perhaps the most dangerous spot in the area?
I think I really think that it's still an open question. I do think that North Korea is probably the most immediate dangerous spot, but we've never been able to figure out which side of the argument the Chinese are on. I mean, obviously they don't want a war on their border. On the other hand, they don't want a collapsed North Korea either, because it's to their security value to have that bumper there. So having a conversation between the North Korean leader and the Chinese leader is still very opaque to us about exactly what their conversation would be about, whether it be an attempt to have the Chinese make sure that North Koreans play nice, or just the reverse. So it's an open question. But the North Korea problem, I mean, I just want to step back for a second. I think the great irony here is that basically during the 8 years of the Obama administration, there was very little done about North Korea.
Oh, I know, yeah.
And I think it's quite appalling, actually, that as the incoming President Trump's meeting with the outgoing President Obama in the White House on the day of the inauguration, Obama turns to the new president and says, by the way, North Korea is your most urgent matter.
Thanks. That's like saying,
thank you for handing me this pile of what as you walk out the door.
And lighting it on
fire. But it does show you just how it's sort of difficult the international security environment is, because that's the most dangerous. The president's team has rightly pointed out that China and Russia are very significant competitors, and you have to deal with what's right in front of you, but you also have to deal with these other problems that are probably just as significant down the road.
During the second surge, during the Obama administration, before his passing, I would regularly get together with former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, and he was on the program, and we asked about the surge and what he thought it would do. He says, listen, we're running into a place, economically speaking, that all we have are our military forces. We have no other power in the world. We can't sanction somebody when our economy is so bad that they're not interested in selling stuff here anyway. Are we getting, from an economic national security level, getting back to a place where people want to do business here? And does that give us at least the authority to tell somebody, these sanctions are going to keep you out of a very good marketplace, and then saving soldiers' lives by doing it? Or is that too much of an abstract for a direct discussion of national security?
Well, I think it's a little bit of places like Afghanistan, we're not, their economy is so small that, whatever, ties they would have with the U.S. is minimal on the economic front.
Well, I meant with Russia, especially.
Well, with Russia, we've put sanctions on a variety of entities and people in Russia, but we really haven't put significant sanctions on the leadership and their economy the way that, for example, we did with Iran and they're starting to do with North Korea. Mm-hmm. So, the difficulty there is less that the Russians do a lot of business with us, is that they have done a lot of business with our European partners, and so you have countries like Germany, for example, who are very reluctant to go down that road, just because they do have significant business, or would want to have significant business with Russia. So that's the holdup, is that our leverage on the global stage on some of these places is minimal. Now, having said that, both Europe and the United States have come to the point where they believe that the Chinese are not playing fair on the economic front.
Right.
And so I do think there's a place where a concerted action between working together in Europe and the U.S. We actually could make a difference when it comes to Chinese behavior, particularly on the economic front, but also on the international front as well.
Does energy independence, and certainly towards the end, under the private exploration in the Dakotas especially, we became an energy exporter for the first time in my adult lifetime, and we continue to seem to want to grow that, and that helps our allies be able to know that they have energy, but it also puts us in a place where Russia also is an energy exporter, and one of their bigger, I guess it's still pointed to as one of the big ways Putin saved the collapsed Soviet Union was tapping into their energy resources. Is that going to be really the I don't want to say battleground because that's overly inflammatory, but where our importance in the world is going to continue and has to be watched to make sure we can be energy independent and also supportive to our allies?
Yeah, no, there's two points to make about that, but you're absolutely right. The first one is with the ability to expand our exports in oil and gas, it does give allies the ability to know that in the crunch there's other sources than from the Middle East or Russia. Mm-hmm. But the other important point, I think, is that the Russian economy really, and the state economy really isn't very healthy, and the way they've been able to maintain themselves is by having export oil and gas at a fairly high price. But with the U.S. being able to enter the world market the way it has, the price of oil and gas has not risen to the level that the Russians would need to be able to continue to sort of expand their military in the way that they had planned and or use their military in a more aggressive fashion. So keeping U.S. In the world oil and gas market, the way we've become a superpower again in that regard, is really beneficial, and just keeping the resources out of the hands of Putin and his mafia.
Yeah, exactly. And at least saying you got a choice. You don't have to buy it from the Gambinos. Gary,
yeah, exactly. I like that.
Gary Schmitt is the resident scholar, co-director of the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies, and the director for the program on American citizenship at the American Enterprise Institute. I want to ask, controversial, he's been a guest on this program several times, John Bolton is a national security advisor. A lot of people saying, oh, he's a hawk, this is dangerous, he's a neocon. I mean, I've heard every possible thing. I've found John Bolton to be a fairly level-headed person. What does the John Bolton NSA position mean on our international level in your analysis, Gary?
Well, I mean, John's a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute, and I've known John for a number of years. I think one of the things that people underestimate about John, I mean, he's certainly hawkish. I mean, so am I. So I mean, we're not throwing rocks at each other across tables. But people forget that John's worked in a variety of different administrations. Republican administrations, going back to the Reagan administration, and he's worked under a number of different bosses who have different, viewpoints. Mm-hmm. And John's been really quite successful in being able to work under a variety of people, and without sort of losing his ability to talk truth to power. So I think people's worries that John is going to fly off the handle and sort of and that he'll feed President Trump's immediate reactions to things, I think are just wrong-headed. And John's much more sensible and pragmatic and experienced official than people are giving him credit for.
Is that an important part of any White House or any organization, is the ability of those on the staff to manage up sometimes? I learned that kind of midpoint in my adult life was that, in order to get the resources you need to be successful in where you may be in the organization, you need to somehow be able to manage up to your supervisors as well. And you mentioned talking truth to power is sort of the very good political analogy to it. Is he the kind of person that President Trump needs as we go into this next phase of the Trump administration?
Well, and I also think, having worked in the White House and also worked in the Senate, I've had to do not that level, but I've had to do similar things where your boss, his immediate reaction, and maybe even the immediate right reaction is to do X, but you realize you have to have the ability to pull the rest of the bureaucracy along with you. You also often have to make sure the allies aren't surprised by something you do. So, just being able to sort of say, okay, that's a good idea, boss, but we have to make sure we get our ducks in a row before we go off and do it, is an important capacity, and I think John has it. The other thing I would say is that he's also coming into government along with former Congressman Mike Pompeo, who is an impressive man in his own right, and I think will, unlike Mr. Tillerson, who was a very decent man but never seemed to get a handle on his job as Secretary of State, what you're going to have now a fuller national security team, I think, with Pompeo at State and Mattis at Defense and John at the NSC. So I think it's less John than it's this new team that's going to matter.
Well, and certainly that is what you want to have is good advice, and nobody believes, and I think for once we have a president that is trying to make it seem like, hey, I got a team here and I need my team. It's not just me and my pen and my phone. Last question. We have about a minute left, Gary. Our alliances, you mentioned our allies in the world. The previous administration went on a tour of places, sort of apologized for America. very quickly it seems like our alliances have strengthened back to a place they haven't been in many years. Is that a fair thing to say about our position on the globe?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sort of under reported is the degree to which, particularly in Europe, while President Obama was popular as a president among the citizens of Europe, he wasn't particularly popular among the governments of Europe. They felt like he, in particular, with his pivot to Asia, was ignoring them, and there were different policy initiatives that came as surprises that they weren't happy with. While they certainly don't find, the citizens, again, don't find President Trump somebody they like, it is true that, for example, on defense spending, the allies in Europe are spending more, maybe not as much as we would want or as quickly as we want, but they are spending more. And we are, sort of working with them to try to, address the Iranian problem. So
with coalition, yeah.
Yeah, so again, I think the picture is a little bit more mixed than people have been reporting.
Well, Gary, I do appreciate it. AEI.org is what you find Gary, and Gary Schmitt, the resident scholar, co-director of Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies, director of the program on American citizenship, all at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for your time this weekend. I do appreciate it, and have a wonderful remainder of the Easter weekend.
Thank you. Same to you.
And thank you for listening. God bless you this Easter Sunday, this Easter weekend, and I hope you have family and friends around. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.